The Sega Saturn is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated consoles out there, often overshadowed by the far more popular competitor from Sony, the original PlayStation. But the Saturn has quite a few games and is honestly one of the best looking consoles out there. And in today's video, we'll be refurbishing this beautiful Hi-Saturn variant, which was manufactured and sold by Hitachi instead of Sega, which is pretty interesting. And I'll be modding it with an FRAM mod chip so that we can preserve our save data without the need of a coin cell battery. Now, since this is a pretty uncommon version of the Saturn, I actually do want to keep it basically stock, but I also do want to enjoy the entire library that the Saturn has to offer. Thankfully, the Sega Saturn has no shortage of basically plug-and-play solutions for optical drive emulators. We'll be taking a look at three in particular: the Fenrir, which I previously covered, the Satiator, and lastly, the Saroo. We'll explore how each of these work, what their pros and cons are, and which one I think is worth your hard-earned money. So sit back, relax, and let's dive right in. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. So in today's video, we're going to be focusing on the Sega Saturn, which in my opinion is one of the most slept on retro consoles out there. What I have here is a pretty rare Sega Saturn called the Hi-Saturn, which is a variant marketed and manufactured by Hitachi rather than Sega. Other than its unique branding here on top, its only other differentiator is that it comes with one of these: a video CD card that allows you to play games with enhanced video and also to watch video CDs, which is basically a dead format. Other than that, it's your basic run-of-the-mill Sega Saturn. Now, while this particular unit isn't really good cosmetic condition, I'm still gonna tear it down, give it a deep clean, and refurbish some of its components, primarily the CD assembly, to ensure it stays reliable for the foreseeable future. And while we're in there, I'm gonna be installing a FRAM chip mod. Changing out the stock SRAM chip to FRAM means we no longer need to rely on a battery to keep our save data. Much like the batteries in your Pokemon games, if it dies, so does your save data along with it. FRAM chips don't require a battery to retain your save data, meaning it'll essentially last forever. Now to install this, I'll be using a Flex PCB from Zaxor, which makes this mod easier and cleaner, as well as completely reversible. Zaxor makes some of the best mods out there for a lot of different consoles, so definitely check out what he has to offer. I'll leave a link to where you can find him down below in the video description. Anyway, after I mod the system, I'll of course want to play some games on it. And taking a quick look online at different marketplaces like eBay, we start to see that Sega Saturn games are pretty darn expensive. Thankfully, we now have a slew of optical drive emulators, or ODEs, that enable us to load games directly from an SD card, allowing us to enjoy the Saturn's library on original hardware. We'll be taking a look at three options in particular: the Satiator, Saroo, and Fenrir. There is another option called the Mode, but I unfortunately wasn't able to get one of those to test out for this video. We'll be taking a deep dive into each of these, seeing how they work, their pros and cons, and which one I personally recommend after testing them all out. I'll of course have timestamps in the video description so you can hop around the video to the parts that most interest you. Now, before we take apart this beautiful Hi-Saturn console, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order, and again, a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Alright, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start tearing down this Sega Saturn. Alright, so we're going to give this Saturn a deep clean and also service the CD assembly by cleaning the laser guide rails and re-lubricating them. And while we're in there, we're going to also install the FRAM mod so we no longer need to rely on a battery to retain our game saves. So sit back, relax as I tear down this Sega Saturn. Great, with the motherboard out, I wanted to inspect the electrolytic capacitors to see if they're leaking, and visually they all look to be in great shape. So for now I won't be replacing them, but I will probably do so in the not too distant future since this console is just about 30 years old at this point. Next, we need to identify the SRAM chip, which is here in the lower left part of the board next to the BIOS. We'll begin by tinning the legs of the chip with fresh solder, which will help us solder in the flex PCB later on. Next, we need to locate pin 20 on the SRAM IC, which is marked by this white dot here, and then we're going to go ahead and lift it. Now we're going to go ahead and grab Zaxor's flex PCB. I went ahead and tinned all the pads, which should help when soldering it into the SRAM IC. Zaxor recommends placing some Kapton tape on either side of the chip to help insulate the surrounding components. Now go ahead and align the flex PCB to the SRAM pins and solder it in place. Now one thing you need to do is ensure that the pad for pin 20 on the motherboard is soldered to the requisite pad on the flex PCB, otherwise this mod will not work. Next, go ahead and solder in the FRAM chip, ensuring that it's oriented correctly as shown. In hindsight, I think it would have been a lot easier to actually solder in the FRAM chip to the flex PCB before installing it onto the motherboard. Anyway, next we need to connect the FRAM chip to 5 volts. This can be tapped from the left pad of resistor R114, which is actually not populated on this board as you can see here. Then solder the lifted pin 20 to the other 5V pad on the flex PCB. Alright, this is what the complete FRAM mod should look like when using Zaxor's kit. So with the FRAM mod complete on the motherboard, we can move our attention to the sink, while I'll be deep cleaning the Saturn shell with some warm water, dish soap, and a toothbrush. Now one thing to take note of are the labels on some of these shells. Some don't take very well to getting wet, so for those consoles I tend to clean them with a damp microfiber cloth and clean around the labels. I found that many Sega consoles like the Saturn have very resilient and water resistant labels, but definitely do check beforehand and use good judgment before submerging any labels on the shell in water. Alright, with everything clean, we can set it all aside for it to completely dry. Now here you can see the top shell, which I actually didn't submerge in water, and that's because it has a lot of tiny parts and it was pretty clean to begin with. There was some dust here and there, so I just wiped it down with a damp microfiber cloth. I also got into some of the nooks and crannies with a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol. I also cleaned and applied some fresh grease to all the pivoting points and mechanical parts of the shell that are related to the CD door. This again is to ensure smooth operation for years to come. Alright, now let's go ahead and clean and lubricate the CD assembly. To do this, I'll start by removing the guide rail. I'll then set aside the laser assembly and then clean off all of the old grease with some isopropyl alcohol. Then I'll go ahead and reassemble everything and apply some fresh grease to all the contact points. And to finish things off, I'll give the laser a very delicate clean with a Kim Tech wipe and some IPA. Now all that's left is to put it all back together. And before we call this project done, I like to finish things off by applying some Aerospace 303 protectant to give the shell a nice matte sheen, as well as a UV protective layer. And there you have it, folks, a clean and FRAM modded Hi-Saturn. Man, I am so glad to have finally refurbished this Saturn, since it's been sitting on my shelf for a long time, and while it was already in pretty good condition, it is now looking and working fantastic. And when it comes to that FRAM mod, the great thing about it is that I no longer need to worry about losing my save data, since I no longer rely on those coin cell batteries that seem to just die all the time. Installing an FRAM chip is a great mod to have to ensure you never lose any of your saves, and it works great in conjunction with some of these ODEs that don't inherently allow you to save games directly onto the SD card. Which actually brings me to the next and probably the part of the video most of you are interested in, which is taking a look at 3 different ODEs. We have the Fenrir, Saroo, and the Satiator, which is the one we're going to be taking a look at first. Now, before I start getting into the Satiator, I do have to give a quick shout out to Dave of Sega Saturn Shiro, who let me borrow their unit for review. If this video has piqued your interest in the Sega Saturn, and you want to learn more about the console and all of the latest news for it, definitely check out their website and take a listen to their weekly podcast, which I'll of course have linked down below in the video description. So the Satiator was created by a very talented individual named Dr. Abrasive, who continues to support and improve the Satiator to this day. The device itself is smaller than a deck of cards, and it plugs right into the accessory port in the back of the Saturn. This port is typically meant for accessories like the video CD card, which would allow you to play games that have expanded video capabilities, as well as video CDs themselves, which was a video format that never really took off here in the States, but was really popular in Asia. Here on the back, we got a full-size SD card slot, which is where all your games are of course stored, as well as the menu system files. And here on the left is a micro USB port for system diagnostics and debugging. And here on the bottom is a conveniently placed little tab that pulls out to help you remove the Satiator from the Saturn. Operation is super easy. Simply plug it into the back and that's it. After powering on the console, you're launched into the menu system, which at a glance is pretty bland and looks almost like a DOS menu, but at the end of the day, it shows all of your games clearly and launches them at a press of a button. Now, I should note that there are other unofficial menu systems that you can use that have a flashier user interface, one of which is a menu system called Rings. From my understanding, this menu also offers other advanced features, such as per game saves, which is a capability that is not present on the stock menu system. This brings me to the pros and cons of the Satiator. Starting with the pros, the biggest one is game compatibility. After speaking with Dave, he explained that the Satiator has one of the highest compatibility rates with Saturn games, and of the handful of games that I've tested, I hadn't had any issues running them, and this includes US and Japanese titles. And when it comes to accuracy of emulating the Saturn CD block, the Satiator is at the top of the list. Loading games is pretty quick, but another device we're going to be looking at can actually load games even faster. But that's not necessarily always a good thing, and we'll see that in just a moment. So because of the Satiator's high accuracy in emulating the CD block, it is the top choice for those in the homebrew and fan translation community. While other devices may struggle to launch patched games with language translations, the Satiator tends to breeze right through them without any issues. Now, another great thing about the Satiator is that it's obviously plug and play. This means that you can bring it with you and easily pop it into a friend's Sega Saturn and just have it work, since there's absolutely no modding required to the console, and it's compatible with all Sega Saturn revisions. And since it plugs into the back, it means that we still have the ability to utilize the disk drive to play our physical library of games. Now again, another point that Dave mentioned is that Professor Abrasive is very active in resolving and repairing bugs as they are discovered, which again results in a robust and accurate representation of the optical drive, leading to very high compatibility of Saturn titles. And the last pro, which may be important to some folks, is that the Satiator is actually made right here in the United States, which is most likely a major contributor to its high price tag. And that actually brings me to the cons. Now, the biggest con, as I just alluded to, and what I think will give most folks pause in picking one of these up, is the price tag. Now, originally the Satiator retailed for $260, which is really expensive. Thankfully, the price has recently been reduced to $200, but still the sticker shock is real, and this is the most expensive option we'll be reviewing in this video. Additionally, I actually ordered one of these several weeks ago when I was planning this video, and the wait time isn't the shortest. It does say it will ship in 1 to 2 weeks on their website, but it's been over 2 weeks and I still haven't received notification of shipment yet. Again, thankfully Dave did allow me to borrow his unit. Now, another con is that the Satiator does block the accessory port, meaning we cannot install the video CD card at the same time. And because the Satiator at the moment cannot emulate this device, we are unable to play some of the titles that require it. However, this is a very tiny group of games, and actually some of the folks in the homebrew community have modified these games, Lunar Silver Story Complete being one of them, so that it can be played without this card. So this may not be such a huge issue at the end of the day. Now, when it comes to saving your game progress, the Satiator is a bit limited when using the stock menu software like I am. As of now, the official menu system does not support saving directly onto the SD card, but it does allow you to save to the onboard memory on the Saturn, which is where that FRAM mod that I did comes in handy since I no longer need to rely on that coin cell battery. But again, if you are using the official menu system, you are relegated to saving directly onto the console or using a backup memory card like this one. However, using something like the Ring's menu system offers a more visually appealing UI, but also supports something called per-game saves. This allows you to save directly to the SD card and would be a good solution to this issue. Setting up Rings does take a bit more upfront work to get up and running, but could be a worthy option to pursue. I think once I get my unit in the mail, I will be running the Ring software. Now, one interesting thing is that in the Getting Started instructions page on the Satiator website, it states that a working coin cell battery is required in order for the Satiator to boot, which I thought would be a pretty major con if true, as that would be extremely annoying to make sure you always have a charged battery in the console in order to use this ODE. So I actually tested this and removed the battery from my Hi-Saturn, and to my surprise, the Satiator still worked fine. Now, I don't know if the Hi-Saturn is a special case, which I don't see why that would be, but for those of you with the Satiator, let me know in the comments if you also found that you're able to get it to boot up without a battery. Now, this last con isn't really a con at all, but let me explain. Some games for the Saturn require additional RAM, kind of like the expansion pack for the N64. These games require a RAM card in either a 1MB or 4MB configuration. The Satiator supports these games and does allow you to use these RAM cards without issue. The reason I say this is a quote con is because we'll be taking a look at another ODE in a moment that actually has RAM already integrated into it, meaning you don't need to use this extra accessory to run those few games that require it. And with that, this actually brings me to the next ODE we'll be taking a look at, which is the Saroo. This particular ODE is quite a bit different from the Satiator. Instead of using the accessory port on the back of the console, it goes right here in the cartridge slot. As I previously mentioned, this slot is used for RAM expansion as well as backup memory for saving your games. The main benefit of utilizing the cartridge slot is that it has extremely fast data lines which improve game load times. However, this is also the Achilles heel of the Saroo, which I'll be getting to a bit later. The great thing about the Saroo, like the Satiator, is just how easy it is to use. Simply load a SD card with your Saturn games, plug it into your console, and you're off to the races. It's that simple. Of the 3 ODEs that I'm reviewing, the Saroo is the least compatible with games, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because in reality, all these devices, including the Saroo, have very good compatibility and in all likelihood can play most of the library's popular titles. Now, the Saroo actually started development over 10 years ago by an individual named TP Unix, but only recently has it become a viable option and really one of the best ways to play games on the Saturn as it has gotten a lot of support lately. As of the making of this video, I'm running a fork of the version 0.7 firmware, and I have to say I'm pretty impressed with the user interface. As you can see on screen, I'm running an animated background along with some background music. I actually downloaded this Snatcher theme from the Williams DSW GitHub, and I absolutely love it. Now, with the Saroo being an open source solution, there are just a ton of options to choose from, with different versions and even some units using reconstituted chips instead of brand new ones, making it hard to choose from who to buy one from. Well, thankfully the folks over at J&T Studios are making high quality units with brand new components that are compatible with the latest firmware. They also come with a very high quality injection molded shell, which I believe was made by the folks over at Retro Game Restore, who, as you may or may not know, make a ton of fantastic replacement injection molded shells for a bunch of retro consoles like the Super Nintendo and NES. They actually sent this unit over to me free of charge for this video, but I can vouch for their quality as I've covered quite a few of their other really neat mod kits on this channel. The board appears to be very good quality with a properly chamfered connector. This is something that a lot of the other manufacturers tend to cheap out on, and it will cause damage to your connector pins if it isn't chamfered at an angle like this. On AliExpress, you can find Saroos running anywhere in between 30 and around 50 bucks, but the J&T unit is quite a bit more expensive at $85 with the shell included. You're definitely paying a premium for these, but the company has a good track record of making good quality products and is better than gambling on a unit from AliExpress. Now, to help soften the blow just a little, J&T is giving you the viewers a coupon to save $5 on your purchase, which I'll have listed down below. Anyway, let's talk about the pros and cons of the Saroo. I think one of the most attractive things about the Saroo is the price and its convenience. Even purchasing the more expensive version from J&T Studios, it is still the cheapest ODE I'm featuring in this video. It's less than half the price of the Satiator and about $40 cheaper than the Fenrir. It's a simple plug-and-play option that requires absolutely no modding of the console, and like the Satiator, you get to keep your CD drive, so you can still play your physical games as well, and I love that. Now, where the Saroo differs from the Satiator, and in my opinion also makes it a more compelling option, is the fact that it integrates the 4MB of additional RAM into the Saroo itself. This is really awesome because it can natively support any game that requires additional RAM. A lot of these fighting titles from Capcom and SNK do require additional memory, so if you're into these games, the Saroo is looking pretty good. And with RAM packs being kind of expensive, adding that cost on top of the cost of the Satiator or the Fenrir makes the Saroo an even better value since you don't need one of these at all. Additionally, another pro is loading times, which is blazing fast. Both the Satiator and the Fenrir are also fast, but tend to more accurately emulate the optical drive timing. Now, while fast loading is great and all, it can be an issue when it comes to game compatibility, which actually brings me to the cons. So when loading a game on the Saturn using any of these ODEs, the console is expecting a certain load time. In cases of games that are loaded too quickly, it can cause the game to glitch or crash, since the Saturn isn't expecting all of that speed. This makes game compatibility a bit spotty on the Saroo, but it's still very good and plays pretty much everything you would want to play from the retail Saturn collection. Additionally, since it's open source, compatibility is being improved on a game-by-game basis, so the hope is that compatibility will improve over time. Now, another tiny con is that since the Saroo occupies a cartridge port, you're unable to use other accessories that utilize that port, such as the X-band modem. Of course, since the infrastructure for Sega Netlink online services haven't been in existence for years, the X-band is pretty much obsolete. However, of course, modders have managed to get the Sega Netlink online services working again, allowing folks to play Saturn games online. So while the Satiator and the Fenrir are able to use the X-band modem, the Saroo is not. But there's a silver lining here for the Saroo. If you look at the board, you can see that it has this USB-C port on the side, and that may allow in the future for online capability. This is of course not confirmed, but a possibility nonetheless. And the last con has to do with the hardware itself. Since the Saroo is over 10 years old at this point, a lot of the components that it uses are no longer being manufactured. So makers of the Saroo, like J&T Studios, are relying on new old stock components, which are getting harder and harder to find as time goes by. So there's a chance that part supplies could dry up unless there is an update to the hardware itself so something more modern can be used. Again, this is a small con as the risk of running out of these parts is likely many years away. Alright, let's talk about the last ODE, which is the Fenrir. Now, I actually covered this device in a previous video, and as an ODE, it's great. The one that I have here is actually the original Fenrir, and not the Duo, which is a newer version. Now, because the Fenrir does replace the optical drive, it means that you can no longer play your physical library of games, which is kind of a bummer. That is, unless you get something called the Saturn Switcher, which is an accessory mod to the Fenrir made by Will's Console Mods that allows you to have both the original disk drive as well as the Fenrir by moving the Fenrir itself into the accessory bay of the Saturn. And like both the Satiator and the Saroo, it can load games right off of an SD card while keeping the optical drive intact when the Sega Saturn switcher is installed. Now, what makes the Fenrir unique in comparison to the Satiator and the Saroo is its use of an ESP32. This gives it Wi-Fi capabilities. At the moment, Wi-Fi features are a work in progress, and it appears that it's currently in beta. One of the features that the developers have been testing is launch game streaming, meaning that you could remotely host all of your games on, say, a PC or a network-detached storage or NAS device that is connected to your network and play it over Wi-Fi instead of directly off of the SD card itself. Now again, you shouldn't be basing your purchasing decisions on features that don't really exist yet, but this does seem to be Fenrir's ace in the hole if this Wi-Fi capability does ever come to fruition. It would be the only ODE to have this game streaming feature. Alright, so now let's take a look at the pros and cons of the Fenrir device. Starting with the pros, when it comes to game compatibility, it's roughly on par with the Satiator and slightly better than the Saroo. In terms of price, the new Duo model runs at about $120, which is right in the middle of the pack. However, if you do want to retain your optical drive, you will need to purchase the Saturn switcher mod, which will cost an additional $55. This brings the price up considerably to about $175, making it way more expensive than the Saroo, but still cheaper than the Satiator. Alright, so those are the pros, but now let's get into the cons. And the biggest one for sure is that this is the only ODE that requires you to disassemble the console to install it. And if you decide to install the Saturn switcher along with it in order to keep your optical drive, you will need to solder a couple wires as well. This makes the barrier to entry higher than both the Saroo and Satiator, which are both plug-and-play options. For me, the Fenrir is probably my least favorite option since it requires tearing down the console to install it, but the potential for Wi-Fi support in the future could bring it ahead of the pack, but it's too soon to say for now. Alright, so after taking a look at all of these ODEs, which one do I recommend? Well, I want to start by saying that these are all fantastic options and you really can't go wrong with any. But that being said, choosing one of these mostly depends on you and what you value most. For those that want the highest compatibility when it comes to games and homebrew, I'd recommend getting the Satiator, followed by the Fenrir. These are the two most expensive options, with the Satiator being the highest by far. But these are two very solid devices that offer great game compatibility. However, I think for the vast majority of the people out there, the Saroo is the way to go. While game compatibility isn't as good as the other two devices, it does offer 3 other compelling features that compensate for that. First, it has the additional 4 MB of RAM built in, meaning all games requiring that extra RAM simply work out of the box. Additionally, the Saroo can save your game progress files directly to the SD card by default, while the Satiator is unable to do this unless you use a different menu system, and the Fenrir only has the ability to back up your internal Saturn saves. Again, this is just a minor advantage that the Saroo has. But where the Saroo I think really shines is its price. It has all of this capability while also being the cheapest of the bunch. Again, you really can't go wrong with any of these, but in my eyes, the Saroo seems to offer the greatest dollar-for-dollar value out of all of these devices. Well folks, there you have it. A beautifully refurbished Hi-Saturn with FRAM mod, and 3 fantastic ways to play games on it. Now, I actually want to know your thoughts. Which of these ODEs do you recommend and why? Definitely let me know down below in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next time.